Out on the edge of the county line, James's ranch stood as a fortress of hard-earned peace, a place where neighbors should simply be neighbors. But in America, where property lines can become battlegrounds, the tiniest rules can ignite something bigger, darker. One morning, a pair of uniformed strangers arrived with HOA badges and official-looking forms. At their lead stood Karen, her face set in determination, claiming James had crossed community lines. Lines she'd drawn herself. She called in her own brand of justice. Yet behind Karen's threats and official uniforms, something was rotten. What she didn't know, James had once prosecuted corruption for the state, and today, justice would face its reckoning. James, retired attorney general, cherished the quiet power of his ranch. It wasn't just land. It was freedom earned after decades battling bureaucracy and, at times, injustice itself. Despite the rolling meadows and tranquil lake, recent months had brought conflict. The local HOA, under Karen's leadership, grew aggressive. Rules intended for community upkeep became weapons for exclusion. Karen wielded HOA regulations with zeal, using them to draw lines not just around lawns and fences, but around belonging. The HOA's complaints grew about James's barn color, his guest parking, even his choice of flag. The tone behind the letters, the warnings, the veiled references felt familiar, resembling the subtle forms of exclusion James had seen weaponized against others. Not overt, but coded, persistent. Karen seemed determined to prove that not everyone, especially someone with a history of challenging authority, truly belonged. James saw echoes of structural bias, a system built to protect comfort, not justice. As Trisha Rose describes, structural racism isn't always overt. It hides behind rules, shifting to protect the status quo and blame the targeted, not the system. Karen's version of community was a fortress, and the HOA a gatekeeper. Still, James held his ground. Each sunrise over the lake strengthened his resolve. He documented every HOA letter, every odd visit, every coded slight. He was no stranger to how injustice morphs, sometimes invisible, sometimes official. But the escalation that arrived next would test everything he'd built and everything he believed in. Tension simmered beneath a veneer of civility. Karen began recruiting allies, holding informal meetings about James. HOA newsletters circulated, subtle, sometimes not, with veiled hints that his presence changed the spirit of the neighborhood. James noticed the shift. Neighbors, once friendly, grew distant. Some believed Karen's warnings. James' vehicles were too visible, guests too frequent. Even his ranch animals became part of the complaint list. One autumn afternoon, it escalated. Karen distributed official-looking flyers, claiming the HOA had partnered with local police to enforce community standards. Rumors swirled. The HOA had new powers, and anyone defying their rules faced consequences. James saw through it. The language mimicked authority, but stripped away its substance. Impostor cops, impostor justice. A week later, two men arrived at James's gate. They wore uniforms that looked official, but bore HOA patches, not county insignias. Karen trailed behind, arms crossed, HOA file in hand. "You are trespassing on HOA property," she announced. The men held forms, demanded James comply with eviction, flashed badges that, to a lay observer, might seem real. James, recalling decades of courtrooms and law libraries, asked for jurisdiction proof. The forms were riddled with legal nonsense, the badges clearly replicas. Yet Karen's voice grew louder, leveraging the men's presence to intimidate. She claimed they'd received complaints, that James was disrupting racial harmony, a charge all the more jarring given both Karen and James, but the implication was clear. Anyone different might be next. Structural racism often hides behind rules that seem neutral but are applied with a bias, as described in educational sources about subtle exclusion and institutional gatekeeping. The HOA manipulated authority, attempting to make James question his own standing, much as marginalized groups are routinely pressured to feel other. From coded language to fake law enforcement, Karen's campaign fed off the kind of collective bias that keeps real change at bay. James stood firm. He documented the encounter, filmed the officers, verified their credentials, all the while remembering how easily facades become accepted truths. Neighbors watched from windows, uncertain, silent. Each step of Karen's campaign drew from tactics seen across the country, rules and rituals used not for equity, but for exclusion. Racism, as described in children's books and expert discussions, isn't always direct. Sometimes it's the look, the question, the joke, the rule the assumption, always designed to keep the different on the outside. Karen's faux police became a symbol not just of HOA power, but of the broader system that values comfort and tradition over justice. As the sun dipped, James reviewed his next moves. With his legal training and years championing civil rights, he planned a response not just for himself, but for every neighbor watching in silent discomfort. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose more than just HOA overreach. The next morning, Karen returned, this time with more officers and a crowd. Their cars marked HOA police blocked the dusty driveway. Flyers proclaimed the HOA's zero tolerance for noncompliance. James watched, calm but resolute, knowing real law would prevail. He took out his binder of evidence, official statutes, property deeds, video footage. As Karen ranted about community integrity and the impostor cops tried to enforce their imaginary powers, James took command. He announced his identity, a retired attorney general, a defender of due process and civil rights. Stunned silence swept the crowd. Karen's bravado faltered. The HOA police hesitated, realizing their authority was fabricated. James laid out the facts, explaining jurisdiction, exposing the fake badges, and reading aloud federal statutes against impersonating law officers. He reminded all present of the real meaning of justice, equal treatment before the law, property ownership protected not by intimidation, but by lawful right. Neighbors emerged from their homes, now emboldened. Some whispered, others spoke, as the illusion of HOA power dissolved. Karen protested, but her argument failed against actual authority and legal precedent. James challenged the crowd. Why had they allowed one person's bias to override community values? Who benefited when rules were twisted for exclusion? This climax, like many stories of racial injustice, displayed how official-looking rituals can be weaponized to target the outsider, real or imagined. But James stood not just as a defender of his own rights, but as a shield for the community, resisting the kind of structure that too often keeps society comfortable at the cost of justice. By the end, Karen's facade of control had shattered. The imposter cops faded away. The crowd, once silent, now restless, began to reconsider their complicity. James knew the struggle for justice never ended, but today he'd restored a measure of truth. The battle for fairness, he realized, had only just begun. The dust settled on the ranch, but James understood this victory was just a chapter in a longer struggle. Karen faded from leadership, her tactics exposed and trust eroded. The HOA, pressured by neighborhood opinion and James's legal threats, reviewed its practices, erasing the HOA police program and revising exclusionary rules with new oversight. Yet, the event rippled outward. Some neighbors reflected on their silence, recognizing how comfort and complicity enable injustice, not just in HOAs, but in workplaces, schools, and communities across the country. James hosted a gathering by the lake, inviting dialogue about fairness, diversity, and the perils of unchecked authority. He spoke of the difference between order and injustice, how rules, when wielded by those who seek exclusion, become tools of racism, even if unintentionally. The story, though local, echoed national patterns. Structural racism is rarely obvious. It slides into everyday practices, hidden in committee meetings, bylaws, and official forms. True change stems not only from challenging individuals like Karen, but from examining the systems themselves, why they exist, and whose interests they serve. James closed his speech with a powerful question. What kind of community do we want to be? A place that protects comfort for the few, or justice for all? The crowd, once fragmented, began to talk, listen, and reconsider. Racism isn't just loud moments of hate. It's often subtle, made from rules that seem reasonable until weaponized by those in power. The scandal at the ranch forced the HOA and the people within it to confront uncomfortable truths. It inspired others, near and far, to stand up, speak out, and demand communities rooted in genuine equity, not exclusion veiled as order. James's ranch remained peaceful, resilient, and now a symbol of the power not just to survive injustice, but to transform it. And the story lingered in the minds of viewers, asking, where are the lines we draw, and who do they really serve?